Today we're going to continue or add a little bit more from the preaching last Sunday. We talked about, Samson's revenge. I'm sure most people knew about Samson, about, him fighting the lion and him fighting 1,000 people worth of army of Philistines. And in just one blow, and he's like a one man show. He fights his battles alone, and that really shows his super strength, and that's what he's known for. But what we don't know is the flawed character of Samson, which is very interesting. So today we're gonna continue with that. If you have your Bibles with you, you can open it to Judges chapter 15, and it's also on the screen. We're gonna read from verse 6. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. I know. We're starting off with like, whoa. So let's do a little bit of background there. What happened here is if you remember in chapter 13, Samson was a man born of promise for God to rescue the Israelites from oppression from the Philistines. He was set apart. He was a Nazarite. And he had all these vows he needed to fulfill because he's set apart for God's purpose. And after that, in chapter 14, we see how Samson broke every single vow of that promise or covenant with God. And that begins with marrying to a pagan woman. He was doing things that was right in his own eyes, which is the theme of Judges, and we see that individually, in an individual like Samson, and he wasn't supposed to touch dead or unclean things because he was supposed to be pure and set apart and holy, but he did anyway. He ate honey from the carcass of a lion. He even offered that to his parents, who was supposed to be accountable to Samson. And he also drank alcohol. He had a wedding feast that lasted for 7 days. So Samson really just wasn't honoring God's promises, and that's his disobedience, and he continues on disregarding God's plan, or not seeking God in the things that he does. So what happened here in verse 6 is when they were at the wedding feast, Samson wanted to throw out a riddle, but he really just tricked people. So when the Philistines couldn't figure out this riddle, they went to his wife, and his wife, in the end, Samson told his wife the actual answer to this riddle. So in the end, he lost, and then he felt really betrayed. Of course, he was betrayed because the Philistines cheated, and not just that, they cheated with his wife, and he felt betrayed by his wife too. So he was angry, and he just walked away. Now, after some time in Judges 15, Samson decided, I have a wife, and I want to go be with my wife. So he went to his wife's house, but then his father, like what we read here, his father had given the wife to Samson's best man. Isn't that a plot twist? What a drama. Yeah. These 3 chapters give us a whole show, a whole TV show that you just kind of can binge watch or something.
Right.
So how did Samson react to that? And that's how we got here. Samson decided that he wanted to punish them in a way because of what they did to him. So what he did, he collected 300 foxes. They said that they were jackals because they're easier to collect or gather because they come in packs. So Samson collected all those. He put them in pairs, their tails, and lit it up with fire and let them run in their grains and orchards, and it burned their source of food and livelihood. Of course, it wasn't just his wife and his father-in-law that was affected by that. He involved other Philistines. And so the Philistines retaliated. And so this is what they did. In retaliation to what Samson burning their grains and fields and orchards, the Philistines, without thinking twice, they burned his wife and her father-in-law. Isn't that crazy? So that's where we find ourselves in, and then or where we find Samson, and then he just retaliated also. Samson retaliated, and we find Samson in a cycle of revenge. Now let's skip a little bit because this is a long chapter. So we're going to go to verse 7. Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you. After that, I will quit." And then he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So after Samson, hid in the cave, the Israelites or the Philistines came to the army of Israelites, and the Israelites felt threatened by the Philistines because these guys, the Philistines, were oppressing the Israelites. So it's not good for them to be involved too. And you know what, Miss Jane, sometimes I actually, when I was reading this over and over again, I wondered, what did the Israelites feel, when this was going on? They had this person among them who's really strong, who's capable of defeating their enemy, and yet this is what Samson does. I was just wondering, what was it like to be in their point of view, right? So that's just a thought, So what happened is, Samson decided that it was his fight, and he asked them to bind him in a rope and then give him to the Philistines. The Philistines thought that they had an advantage because he was bound up, but then of course the rope breaks, as we can see here, verse 14. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. It's amazing because the Spirit of the Lord was still with him. Even though he was making all these mistakes, that strength is still with him. And we'll learn more about that later on. Verse 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put out his hand and took it. And with it, he struck 1,000 men. Let me just pause there real quick. Imagine this with me. A fresh jawbone of a donkey. How big is that?
How big is that? When you paused, I was like, I know what she's going to ask. I know what she's going to talk about, because I was thinking the same thing. And how in the world could something small like that strike 1,000 men?
Yeah, it's a donkey. It's not even a grown horse.
That's
so
true.
He put out his hand, he took it, and with it, he struck 1,000 men. I don't know if you've seen a crowd of 1,000 people. And I don't know, how big is a jawbone of a donkey? It's maybe this big, and you strike 1,000 men with it? How?
Right. Well, it's kind of like the stone in the sling. The stone in the sling.
Yeah.
Big giant.
Yeah, but this one is like bigger proportions.
I know.
Small, and then 1,000 people.
Yeah.
That is so crazy. Samson said, With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. Let's continue reading. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath-Lehi. He was very thirsty. After fighting 1,000 men with one jawbone, I feel like it's a whole body workout. We just that weapon. You're gonna exert a lot of effort. And then he became very exhausted. He became very thirsty. He called upon the Lord and said, "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Verse 19, this is where we see God in this. And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called En-Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines. 20 years. That's just a part of chapter 15. So it's been a roller coaster reading about Samson. Like I said, it's kind of like a show that has 5 seasons just because of the plots and twists and the turns. So the tension that we want to talk about today is this. Having read this story, it's the author has shown us what Samson's character really is, right? And what is that? He is witty, he is cunning, he's really smart, and he uses whatever resources he have in front of him, and he's able to succeed and win battles just with that. But also, he's quite selfish. He always intends to get what he wants, and if he doesn't get what he wants, he, gets really angry. He gets aggressive. He's violent. He's among the people that he has encountered that we see he's rude and disrespectful towards them. He's a really selfish person. He only thinks about himself. And so Samson, in his character, we see, we see weaknesses in his character. And what is that? He has an emotional weakness. Yeah. He he just acts on impulses, and he doesn't think twice about it. He doesn't consult anybody about it, but whatever strong feeling that he has, he acts on it. He doesn't know how to control his emotions. He doesn't realize the consequences of those actions as well. And then, he has, I would say, reading from this, he was spiritually weak because he, like I said, he acted on impulse. And we don't see him seeking God, in the things that he does. He just, he just acts on his flesh. He gets what he wants. Like he saw a beautiful woman and he got her as his wife. Miss Jane, what do you think so far?
Well, one of the things that came to mind when you were describing Samson and his response to not getting what he wants, like, throwing a fit, being rude, disrespectful, my first thought was like a child, very immature, yeah. Very selfish, and that's how children act. But then the scary part is, as adults, and even, as being a Christian for, quite some time, you still see yourself having those types of tendencies where sometimes when you don't get what you want, sometimes when you pray, you don't get what you want, things don't go your way, things don't go as expected, you kind of get like that. You may not be falling on the floor, or maybe some of you are, I don't know, but you're not really like falling on the floor and, kicking and screaming and stuff like that. But we do have those types of attitudes sometimes, at a different degree. So I can see, maybe it came from like spiritual immaturity or something like that, because kids are, immature, like mentally, and then that's just how they act. But then as adults, maybe we still are spiritually immature in a way, and that's why we still have to have a lot of growing to do.
Yeah, I agree. Myra, let's look at the comments real quick. Myra even admits herself as well. She said, Samson is like a spoiled brat, which sometimes I can be. And what else? Gabby says, Samson acts on his own accord without even asking God for direction. That's another pulling off of Samson.
You know what that makes me think of when you said, Samson doing things alone. And I think that's what the problem was. He was doing things on his own. And just like Gabby said, acts on his own accord without even asking God for direction. So he was doing things alone. And when we do that, we know that puts us and even other people around us in danger.
Yes. Yeah. Myra adds, Samson didn't practice having a thankful heart, even though he experienced God's favor many times. Yes. So, with this, weaknesses, right? How is God able to work in our lives when we have emotional weakness, maybe even physical weakness, and also spiritual weakness when we're immature? Is God still able to work in our lives? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So our first point today, God's purpose prevails over our selfish actions. God's purpose prevails over our selfish actions. We see, in verse 15, he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, remember this? And put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. The Spirit of the Lord still enabled him and empowered him, and activated that strength that God deposited in him, despite his selfish action. You see, Samson's motive for fighting the Philistines were personal. Again, he was acting on his selfish action. His ego and pride were bruised. So he felt like when the Philistines attacked burned his wife and father-in-law, he felt like it was an attack on him as well. So he took it personal. He is emotionally weak for not being able to control and subdue his emotions. Rather, he was controlled and subdued by his emotions. It was the other way around. Like what we said, he was immature in that. He sought revenge for the injustice, right, that he felt was done towards him. He fought a personal battle, but he won the bigger battle. And I don't know if he realized that or not, but he won the bigger battle. And what is that bigger battle? The Philistines' oppression of the Israelites. Samson thought only of himself, yet God was still thinking of Israel and his promise to rescue them. God's purpose was not just about Samson as the leader, but his purpose was for the nation of Israel, and God was still thinking of that. Samson may have been distracted from God's purpose, but God still worked to fulfill that purpose. So, we see here, like what we said, God's purpose prevails over our selfish actions. God's purpose transcends just personal fulfillment. It goes beyond that. And so when we are in the way, God sees that still as an opportunity. God still finds opportunities for him to use us to fulfill his purpose. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. God's purpose prevails over our selfish actions. And I think that's something that we need to be thankful for, because it doesn't fall on us. Like what we've talked about the past couple of weeks, God is still sovereign. And we see that here in this story. Samson achieved victory not because of his own motive. It's not coming from his own strength, but because of God's sovereignty and power. God used his mistakes to fulfill his plans, and it was God's power that allowed Samson to defeat a big army of the Philistines, all with a single jawbone of a donkey.
Yeah.
Miss Jane, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it reminds me of something that you said in your preaching on Sunday. How when God did something, it was miraculous. So there was no other way that, God would do things. We have a big God, and he wants to make sure that he's known, in whatever happens in this situation. So for Samson to, kill 1,000 people with a donkey's jawbone, you know that it's really God doing something. There's no doubt. There's no way that Samson can or should still take the credit for that, because there's no way that he could do that.
And it's not from the donkey. There's no magic with the donkey.
In the jawbone.
Don't try it.
A magical jawbone. No, with any kind of jawbone. Not even just donkeys.
Right.
But another thing that you said was that God had a bigger purpose. And I think for us, we are so limited that we fail to see what God's bigger purpose is, and in our lives, and even how he's going to use us, whether if it's our mistakes or weaknesses or anything, for even a bigger purpose that's even outside of ourselves. And so God always has a bigger purpose, and a lot of times you just don't see that bigger picture. Because like what you said, we're just too distracted, and we have those selfish tendencies where we just want to focus on ourselves. And sometimes we say okay, God, what are you doing in me, through me? What are you doing in me? And then sometimes we forget to be like, hey, God, but can you also reveal maybe what you're going to do outside? How are you going to, what's your purpose, not just with me, but with our spiritual family? How are you going to use it for not just our spiritual family, but, outreach and going out more with that. So yeah, lots of things to take from this story, and we're only in a small part.
Thank you for sharing, Miss Jane. I wonder, what about our audience tonight? So what are your thoughts? While we wait for people to reflect or comment on that, this is more reflection also. So God has given us, when we relate to Samson, like what Miss Jane said, when we realize our Samson tendencies, let's reflect that God has given us purposes. All of us, every single one of us, God has given us a purpose. And not just that, he has given us the ability to do them, just like he did with Samson. When we stray away, or when we still feel like we're immature in our faith, or when we disobey, when we make mistakes, because of God's sovereignty, he can turn our disobedience into opportunities for his plan. I mean, come to think of it, when God gave that purpose in our lives, I think he knew our tendencies.
Yeah.
He knew what our weaknesses are. He knew where we're at in our level of maturity in our faith. He knew if we're stubborn or not. And so God's sovereignty is still at work despite that. He's still able to fulfill his purpose. When we have disobeyed and we think that there weren't any consequences, we probably, when we disobey, right? And we didn't feel the consequence right away, or didn't feel like, you know what, I think it's fine. I can keep disobeying. There's probably a sense of relief, because I don't think I suffered any consequences, or I don't think I hurt anybody. So
maybe God gave me a pass on this.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Maybe God gave me a pass on this. I mean, we may feel relieved, but I think it doesn't mean that we got a pass.
Right.
I think it means that, God's grace and his sovereignty is at work.
And mercy.
And his mercy is at work. People are very quiet tonight. They're still reflecting.
Oh, I think so. That's all right.
That's okay.
No pressure, but we'll check. We'll check again soon.
Yeah, you can keep it coming. We'll move along, but keep it coming.
Don't be shy.
There's some thoughts that are brewing in there. We wanna ask interact with you. We want to know about that. So please do share. I'm gonna switch point of views here real quick. Remember when I said, what was the Israelites' point of view?
Yeah.
Right? Like this great person who has so much potential. Imagine being one of the Israelites at that time and you're witnessing this firsthand. There's this great person. He's like Superman, even better. And he's just wasting his potential. I think from a leadership standpoint, when leader that God has raised fails to do what he needed to do, God continues to fulfill his purpose. God continues to fulfill his purpose. God continues to be faithful, not just, I think, to the leader. He was faithful here in the story, not just to Samson, but he's also still faithful to the people that Samson was meant to lead. I think that's an encouragement, for people who have felt like leaders have failed them or things like that. God's still faithful. God can restore that leader's life, and beyond that too, God can still fulfill his purpose in your life, in our lives. God did not allow the army of Israelites to be attacked or defeated by the Philistines. We don't see that in the story. He still protected them through Samson, just as he had planned. Like what we said, to reiterate our point, God's purpose prevails over our selfish actions. Yeah. I think we have a comment from Gabby right here.
All right, it says, despite the person's weaknesses, God is looking for someone who has the heart to obey him wholeheartedly. Even though we tend to make mistakes, as long as we are humble to acknowledge God's sovereignty over our life, he will clean up our mess and make it a message.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Thank you, Gabby. I think actually that's a very good transition to our next point.
Can I say one more thing though?
Sure, go ahead.
So one word that keeps sticking out to me is still. Oh, God still. You said he still, right? And he did a lot of things. Like he was faithful, but there were a lot of things that he still did or that he continued to do despite Samson's, disobedience and, outright disobedience and everything like that. And some things that I wrote down that, I was thinking about during the study was that he continues and he is still faithful. He continues to protect, fulfilled promises. He continues to fulfill purposes. He continues to use us, right? And he continues to be victorious. And so there's just a lot of things that God is still despite us. God continues to despite us. And that really is that truly shows God's sovereignty and his power.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. I think, can you repeat that? God is
I don't know. I have a horrible memory. I don't know what I said.
Despite blank.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know what? People should use that. Oh, God, thank you. When you're, like what Myra said, to be in a heart of thanks. And so maybe we can take time sometimes to be like, you know what, God, I totally disobeyed you, and then you take a time to repent. Yeah. And then you say, thank you, God, for still or continuing despite blank. Like
yeah. We can use that as your prompt. What do you think? You're still thankful that God is still blank despite blank.
Continues blank.
Yeah, despite or continues blank. What is that for you? Yeah. Like I said, we'll move along, but keep your thoughts coming, keep your comments coming. Yeah. So like what Gabby said here, as long as we humble ourselves to acknowledge God's sovereignty over our life, he will clean up our mess and make it a message. Yeah. I'm going to transition over to our next point, and that is God is our source of strength. God is our source of strength. I know we say that a lot of times, but we talked about being immature. We talked about being emotionally weak. And we talked about, Samson had that physical strength. But what about us? We don't always have that physical strength. So this is our the encouragement for you and for us. God is our source of strength. I'm going to read from verse 18. He was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord. And this is where what Gabby was saying. When we humble ourselves and acknowledge God, he will clean up our mess and make it a message. And I think there's a great message in here. Samson said, "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant." Samson finally, for the very first time, he acknowledged that the battles that he had won, that salvation, being saved from the hands of these ruthless Philistines, is only happened through God and by the hand of your servant. He is acknowledging that he is but a servant of God. And the strength was not from him. It was not from the jawbone of the donkey, right? And so Samson asked, "Shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" I'm not sure, if he's accusing God. Are you gonna let me die? I don't know if he's demanding for water here. I don't know if he's challenging God here, if he's wanting to see what else God can do. I'm not sure, but I think this just shows how what kind of relationship Samson has with God. But let's see, here's how God responds to that prayer. God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called En-Hakkore, and it is at Lehi to this day. God is our source of strength. Samson had super strength, but he didn't have unlimited strength. After Samson's victory, he was exhausted and he felt thirsty to the point of dying. He felt like he was almost going to die. And that's incredible. After going back to defeating 1,000 men with just a jawbone, I would say you would feel elated and feel like that's such a huge success nobody has ever done. But then what did he feel after that success? He felt thirst, and he felt the limitation of his earthly body. And because of that, he was compelled to acknowledge his limitation, and he called on God. He humbled himself, and it made him realize that it was through God that he had won the battle, and it is through God that he will be sustained. He came to the source of strength. He came to the source of strength. And what did God do? God reminded Samson of his sovereignty, of his power, by not just simply giving him water from a river or a well. He did much more than that. He showed Samson a miracle. From a hollow place, water came out. It's a miracle. Just from one drink, Samson was revived, not just physically, but spiritually as well. From this miracle, God was showing Samson that he is still the God of impossible. Samson may have been used to the super strength that he has, and he has gotten used to it. He has gotten over familiar with what God has given him. So I think this was God showing Samson it's not just the only thing that he can do. He is the God of all impossibilities, and he was able to make this miracle, and he was able to revive Samson just with one drink. And here's what I believe, that it was, Samson asked for water because he was feeling physical thirst. But God gave Samson more than that. His spirit returned, and he revived. I think because of this, I believe that Samson's faith increased. Samson's faith in God increased. And that just shows what we can experience when we go to the source of strength. You know, when we're emotionally weak, when we are immature, when we don't know what to do, when we're physically weak, even to the point of dying, we can tap on to that source. Samson prayed just one prayer, and a simple prayer at that, and God showed up. And he showed up with a miracle, and with just one drink, Samson was revived. I think that can happen with us too. Miss Jane, any thoughts?
Too many I have to process real quick and put them all in order.
Sure.
But then for me, what I keep going back to is seeing God's hand at work, because he went from miracle to miracle.
Yeah.
And so even in the beginning, if Samson didn't see it as God and he saw it as his own strength at first, I love how God was still like, okay, well, let me give you one more miracle so you can see that it's really me, you know? And then I feel like, okay, that's God knew when Samson, returned to humility and was like, okay, you know what? I need you, God, to give me that drink. Yeah. I need you, God, to revive me and restore me. And one thing that you said, one of your points was God is our source of strength. But then in my head, I also thought God is our source of strength for what he has purposed or called us to do. So a lot of times, I feel like we could be pursuing something and we want strength for it, but God's like, oh, but that's not really your lane. That's not really what I was calling you to do, or blah, blah, blah. Like, you're going here, but we were supposed to go here. And now you're asking me for strength here, but you're supposed to be here. You kind of strayed away. You kind of like disobeyed me, and you took your own path. Right. So I feel like when God had a plan, he fulfilled it, right? When God had a purpose to use Samson, he fulfilled it with these miracles and stuff, and it was because that was his purpose for Samson.
Yeah. What about you guys? Any thoughts?
I thought you were asking Elijah.
Oh.
I'm like, oh yeah, Elijah.
I know we have Elijah right here and my husband Nathaniel right there. Any thoughts, guys? In our lives, just like Samson, we have battles. We have spiritual battles. And Samson had this great, great victory, unheard of, and using, some say, it's a ridiculous weapon to use, right? And he got that victory. Sometimes the challenges come in our lives, not just from fighting the battle, but after achieving victory and success. Let that sink in a little bit. Sometimes the challenge is not just fighting it's not just when you're facing the battle, but it's after the battle is won. We can still have challenges. Victory and success can be overwhelming. We've talked a lot about, we've talked about this a lot of times. When we've experienced success, we tend to forget God. We tend to forget where we got that from. And it can cause us to, forget who the real source of that strength is. Sometimes after victory and success, God allows us to experience that weakness, to experience that limitation, just like Samson did. He was thirsty to the point of dying. God allows us to experience those things so that we can acknowledge him and call on to him. And even that, God uses as an opportunity to fulfill his purpose. So I want you to be encouraged with that. If you're feeling weak, if you're feeling like you're really limited, and if you're feeling like you can't go on further to fulfill God's purpose, God is your source of strength. I love what, Miss Jane, what you said. God gives us strength for the purpose that he has given us, for the things that he has called us to do. He is our source of strength. I hope you're encouraged with that. Miss Jane, you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, just one more. I love how you said that, when we experience a victory, after that, God can bring us to a place where we experience weakness. And sometimes we can have an attitude about it, like, oh man, God, I was on a high, I was so good, it could be like, I did all this for you, or something like that, right? And then God is like, oh, let me reel you back, and it's for our own good. So it's nothing to complain about.
Right.
And actually, I feel like maybe it could even be, I don't know, this could be a stretch, but maybe even be like rejoice that God has used you. Rejoice that he's bringing you back so you could be refilled by him and him alone. And so I think it's a good reminder for all of us that even if we've reached the goal where we think we're all good, to still remember to go back.
Right.
Go back.
And I think that's exactly what Samson felt, right? I mean, when he, in his prayer, when he asked God, when he said, shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? It's like, it's like telling God, Lord, you've given this great salvation from, by the hand of your servant. Where are you now? He's like, what happened? Where did you go? And I think, sometimes we can experience that sometimes. We experience God's grace and his miracle, and the victory. And then after that, there's a period like, okay, God, what happened? Why am I going through this?
And that makes me think that's even purposeful. God even uses that, if you want to call it a low, God even uses that for his purpose. So the high is for actually all of it is for his purpose. So the getting there, being there, and then the drop again. All of it is for his purpose, and it really is working in us, right? To strengthen us, to grow us, and to remind us that we need to have a reliance on him wherever we are on that journey, whether it's on our way up, at the top, on our way down, or on our way back up again. He's reminding us like, okay, where are you now? He's like, where are you now? Let's do a heart check. It's like, it's like going on a road trip and you have to do like all these speed checks and, pit stops and all that stuff. It's like, he has these heart checks throughout the little journey, that we have. And so I like that God is with us all the time.
Yeah.
He is with us all the time.
That's right. God is the source of our strength, not just in one, not just for one time, not just for one specific battle, but throughout our walk with God. God is our source of strength. And that's really encouraging because we can come to God anytime. I think, what you said, reliance. We need to go to God and rely on God all throughout. Not just when we're facing a battle, not just when we are in the battle, not just when, we have won over the battle, but all throughout.
Yeah.
God is our source of strength, and we need to rely on him throughout.
Yeah.
I think we have a comment here from Christina.
Am I going to read it? Okay. I'm like, it's so quiet. Who's going to read it? Okay, so she says that humility always touches God's heart. We just need to call on to him. When we fall short, what do we do? When we are too emotional, what do we do?
Oh no, Pastor Robert showed up.
Oh boy. Scroll.
I think we're going to pray now. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Okay, I'll read this one. From Pastor Robert. It says, Samson called out to God just because he needs God's help to rescue him from his situation. God's response is an expression of his grace and unmerited favor. Expression of his grace. I like that. Yeah.
God's response is an expression of his grace and unmerited favor. Exactly. Like what we talked about, right? Samson called on to God just because he needed God in that moment. But God being the source of our strength, we need to rely on him and go to him not just when we need it, but all throughout our walk with Him. Thank you, Pastor Robert. See, we read your comment.
And he's laughing. Woohoo!
I know.
You made him laugh.
Thanks for tuning in. All right, so to close, our this word portion for tonight, in verse 20, he judged Israel, Samson. He judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. This is a great ending to a really, really superlative word chapter. This, like what we talked about, despite Samson's emotional weakness and his seemingly incapability to fulfill God's purpose, God was faithful to fulfill it. In this story, God was, even though there wasn't mention, there were only 2 mention or 3 mentions of God, God was present all throughout. God was faithful all throughout this story. Despite Samson's weaknesses, God was able to sustain him and revive his spirit and his strength. And in the end, he was still able to rescue Israel, and God was still able to use Samson to lead Israel. All right, what a word.
I know, definitely. Who would have known? You had a really good preaching on Sunday. I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to talk about on Wednesday? She kind of covered it all, but lo and behold,
I mean, honestly,
prayer night, this is what happens.
As we were going, I'm like, whoa. Also, God's word is just a deep well of wisdom.
Yeah.